Welcome to the first ever episode of Plant Chats. Dr. Dan here. I'm a naturopathic doctor, and I'm here to teach you all about herbs, how you can use herbs for your natural health support, how you can put together herbs and recipes, all sorts of herbal crafts. So definitely subscribe if this is something you're interested in. In this episode, I'm going to be going into herbal energetics, essentially the system of energy healing that exists, but using herbs. So this is an ancient system. It comes from Greek medicine. And in Greek medicine, they described herbs as either hot, cold, dry, or damp. And they also described conditions as hot, cold, dry, or damp. These classifications were kind of overall patterns of health that you could see by certain kinds of symptoms, certain kinds of health issues, and the like. So in this episode, I'm going to be talking about hot conditions and hot herbs. And many of you have heard many of these herbs, but maybe you didn't think of them in this way. In general, in herbalism, we treat using what's called the Law of Contraries. This is essentially that you use an opposite kind of energetics for the kind of condition that exists. So I said before that there was hot and cold and dry and damp. Well, if you have a hot condition, use a cold herb. If you have a cold condition, use a hot herb. If you have a damp condition, use a dry herb. And if you have a dry condition, use a damp herb. But for this one, we're just focusing on hot conditions and hot herbs. And what you can expect from this, I'm going to teach you guys a fire cider recipe. You may have heard this. It's great for immune system, great for the winter when it's getting pretty cold. So I'm going to share that with you guys, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the hot energetics of the body and hot herbs. Hot herbs are a very wide category. You have the culinary spices, a lot of the very hot and spicy type herbs like cayenne, ginger, onion, garlic, horseradish. The other two major classes of hot herbs are the aromatic hot herbs. These are herbs that are used a lot like the other spices in cooking. So you got things like rosemary, oregano, thyme, even lavender. So these herbs contain a lot of essential oils, and in general, essential oils are considered heating and warming in traditional herbal energetics. These herbs in specific help a lot with respiratory conditions, and they increase circulation and kind of move the body, and that's why they're considered warm. Things like lavender have an interesting nature because they're kind of a little bit cooling and kind of warming in a sense. But that's something that's a little bit complex to get into in this episode. Then you have the aromatic oils, which are things like pine oil, cedar oil, things like that, a lot of the tree family. Why they call them hot energetics is because these herbs stimulate the body, they kind of excite the body, they heat it up. As you know, if you've ever, chewed on a piece of ginger, it's very spicy, it makes you feel warm, you kind of feel like you're starting to sweat when you eat it. Same thing with garlic and onion. So those herbs are typically used for cold conditions, which are conditions where somebody feels, poor circulation, where they are very averse to cold, they get cold very easily, and a lot of other conditions we'll talk about. Hot conditions are essentially characterized by inflammation. So a condition is hot if there's a lot of swelling, pain, heat, irritation, redness. Overall, the hot tissue state, as it was called, is a state of overstimulation. And pain is one of the best indicators of this. Somebody in a hot condition, they might have a fever. Makes sense, right? It's like an overheating. Their pulse might be rapid. They are overall overstimulated. So when we're talking about herbal energetics, we're talking about patterns. And the pattern of hot is that feeling of warmth or heat or irritation and inflammation. But it's also overall a state of excitation or an overactivity. So you can have a hot condition of a certain organ system, which we'll talk about more as well. Some examples of hot conditions are conditions where there's a kind of excess of heat or there's an overstimulation. So things like high blood pressure are considered to be a hot condition. Autoimmune diseases in specific are considered to be hot conditions. Interestingly, cold conditions are considered to be chronic. Some other hot conditions are fever, and then probably the archetypal hot condition which is hyperthyroidism. Hyperthyroidism is when there's an excess of thyroid hormone in the body for a variety of causes. But what that leads to is a feeling of heat, a feeling of uncomfort actually from so much heat, sweating, losing weight, everything, anger, irritation, all these kind of very hot, irritated type of conditions. And I want to make this essential point that hot conditions are usually characterized by inflammation. So as I'll get into the next episode, the cooling herbs are anti-inflammatory. So the cooling herbs tend to be used for hot conditions, and that's part of the reason why they have that effect. So you use these hot herbs for cold conditions. The fire cider recipe, super easy to make. You could totally make it at home, very simple. It's essentially a form of tincture, but it's a tincture that you make with vinegar. So basically what you do to make a fire cider, a very hot, energetic herbal mix, you take some garlic, onion, horseradish, cayenne, just a little bit of cayenne, and ginger. Chop it all up, maybe blend it up, put it in a jar, fill it up about halfway. I like to use these 64-ounce mason jars. Fill it up about halfway, and then the rest of it, fill it up with some organic apple cider vinegar. And basically what you do is you leave it in a cupboard, and you let it sit for a couple of weeks. Then, when that couple of weeks is done, you grab it out of the cupboard, and you can strain out the different herbs that are in it, or you can leave them in there still. And what I like to do with fire cider is you can just mix it in with some water. Many people like to use apple cider vinegar first thing in the morning as a kind of jump start to the system. You can use it in that way, but it'll also have a lot of these heating herbs, which are really good for driving out cold conditions. A popular example of a cold condition is, well, a cold, right? That feeling of a coldness. And these herbs help you bring heat into the body and stimulate the immune system. With this fire cider, you can also mix it in with oil and make a kind of delicious dressing. When I taught a workshop about herbal energetics, I made a very, very hot tincture because I wanted the students to understand experientially what hot means in a herb and how you know if something's hot. Well, you'll know if it's hot, if it's spicy, if it's literally warm on your tongue, if when you take the herb, you feel you get warmed up or you feel like you get stimulated from it. So I made a tincture out of ginger and cinnamon, and this was mixed into 50% alcohol. So this is another method of tincturing, which I'll be getting into in future videos if that's something you're interested in. And I made this tincture with cinnamon and ginger, and I didn't tell anybody what was in it, so I didn't tell them what herbs were in it, or even what the energetics of the tincture were. So we sat around a circle, and I basically told everyone to kind of meditate on the taste of the tincture. So they put a few drops on their tongue, and they're supposed to sit there and kind of feel what they feel in their body and try to explain their sensations. And unanimously, people said, oh, I felt really warm on my tongue. I felt like I was kind of starting to sweat. I felt myself like salivating, or my digestive system kind of starting to work. And what was amazing about this is that we looked into the medicinal properties of these herbs, like cinnamon and ginger, and a lot of the things that people reported experiencing are actually the medicinal effects of it. So this was an exercise in not only finding out the energetics of a plant, but also finding out the medicinal uses on your own. So this is something that you guys could do on your own with different herbs once you learn the foundational system of herbal energetics. So that's pretty much it for this episode. In the next episode, I'm going to be going into cold herbs and cold conditions, and in future episodes, damp herbs and damp conditions, and dry herbs and dry conditions. So this system is essentially a way to do energy healing with herbs, because you're not necessarily dealing with biochemical properties of the herbs, but overall symptom pictures. So when somebody has a kind of hot condition, you give them cool herbs, as I said, or they have a damp condition, which, for example, would be characterized by a lot of mucus, a lot of discharges, excess fluids, or fluid buildup in the body, like swelling. You'd give them a dry herb because they're drying. They either pull out the fluids of the body or they bring them back in. So if this kind of thing interests you guys, for the first 10 people that send me a message below So subscribe and send me a message, or I'll have a link in the description to an email you can send a message to. And I'm sending out a free 7-page PDF with a complete system of herbal energetics, some of the things that I mentioned, but in much more detail, including a ton of recipes that you guys can use. And for the first 10 people who send me a message, I'm going to be sending my 2-hour plus workshop that I did on herbal energetics. And also I taught how to tincture. So tinctures are liquid herbal extracts, typically done with ethanol or alcohol. This is a great method of preserving herbs and actually pulling out the maximum medicinal properties of them. So I went into the kind of scientific method of doing it with all the proper measuring out grams and ratios. And I also talked about the folk method, which is what many of you guys might be familiar with if you're kind of dabbling with herbs. The folk method is you basically just do it by eye. You know how your mom just didn't know the recipe for how much salt or pepper or how much oregano to add to the dish, like by gram amount, but they knew, it's a pinch or something like that. That's the folk method. It's where you don't necessarily measure everything, but you kind of do it by eye. So for the fire cider, like I said, you mix in about half of those herbs and then fill it up so at least like 2 inches above it are filled with the apple cider vinegar. Hope you guys enjoy and feel all that warmth from the warm energetics. And be sure to subscribe because I'll be doing many more herbal recipe videos, how-tos, and much more. Also, if you're interested in a podcast for natural health and alternative medicine, check out the Herbal Hour podcast. You can subscribe below. There's tons of episodes on here with expert naturopaths, herbalists, acupuncturists, people who practice yoga. And I basically sit down and we have an inspired discussion about health. And they're generally pretty freeform, but there's tons of useful information for you guys. I've had a lot of naturopathic doctors on. I've had herbalists on, just sharing their wisdom, sharing their story, and going back and forth and having some fun, but actually learning something about our health and how to live in tune with nature, right? So many of you, if you're interested in herbs or have started getting interested in herbs, you notice that almost spiritual connection with nature. And that's kind of what my passion is sharing the knowledge with people of how their bodies can heal, how they have an innate healing response in their body that's completely natural, and that many of the things that we do kind of suppress it. But that's a discussion for another video. Thank you for watching Plant Chats. Dr. Dan, I'll see you soon.